who was that? And he told me, and I'm like, wait, psychedelics are a thing? We invited her back. We sat down, she told us about Michael Pollan's book, about how MAPS had been granted breakthrough therapy designation for MDMA-assisted trials with the FDA. And then importantly, in my mind, she pointed us to the fact that there were 4 or 5 online stores openly selling mushrooms in Canada. And at that moment, I realized that the global zeitgeist had changed. Like whatever was happening, the world had shifted. And so inspired by that, kind of field trip was born.
It starts with just taking that leap.
Man, you have to work hard. You have to be incredibly smart.
Choose something that even if it fails, you are going to be proud of it.
Doesn't matter how badly you got beaten and down.
Be kind, be kind, be kind.
Become a better person, a better leader, the better business.
Go with your gut. I'm Samuel Donner, and this is Finding Founders.
You just heard from Ronan Levy. Levy is now the founder of Field Trip Health, a rapidly expanding therapy program which combines psychotherapy and psychedelics to address treatment-resistant mental health disorders. His clinics span across Canada, US, and Europe, with Levy aiming to establish 75 clinics over the next 4 years. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go back to the beginnings of Levy's story.
Can you tell me your earliest memory?
Well, I guess I should qualify that with like psychedelic inspired earliest memories or actual earliest memories. I'll tell both stories. So I'm trying to think. The earliest memories I have is I have this vague recollection of being in a crib in a blue room, I think in my family's house. I couldn't remember if we were living in Houston at the time or in Toronto. That is probably my earliest memory as in a non-altered state of consciousness. In an altered state of consciousness, I did this experience with some therapists in the US where as part of the experience, they take you back to like the moment of your conception and the moment of your birth. Wow. And I remember, who knows if this was just conceived in my brain or, there's something real about it, but I remember having a conversation because they kind of talk about how your parents, both your mother and your father, from well before you're born, from well before you're conceived on a soul level kind of thing. Accept this to be true or not. I'm not suggesting you need to, and so like I had this memory of hanging out with my parents before I was conceived. And then at the moment of conception, I was kind of like standing there, the 3 of us. And then like I fell through the ground. Like
we'll get back to the podcast right after this break.
Finding Founders is brought to you by the HubSpot Podcast Network with other wonderful shows like CEO School. CEO School, hosted by Sanira Madani, is committed to closing the gap and helping more women level up by sharing stories and strategies from powerful women in leadership. Because nothing bad happens when women make more money. There's a bunch of really cool episodes like Raising Capital, Investing Smart, and Why It's Not About You, where Sanira welcomes Arlen Hamilton to the CEO School Summit. Arlen shares her journey from being broke to investing in over 200 companies led by underrepresented founders and the power of being someone else's first yes. Listen to CEO School wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, back to the podcast.
Into conception kind of thing. It felt very real. It felt very visceral. Like it was an actual experience. Whether it was or not, I can't say, but if that did in fact happen on whatever metaphysical level you want to talk about, then that would be my earliest memory.
Yeah. So can we zoom in on that time period? Because, I know that you might not remember all of it, but it's probably like a compilation of the stories that you've been told and maybe the memories that you actually remember.
Yeah. I've heard a whole bunch of different stories along the way, but as near as I've been able to piece together, my parents had a pretty happy marriage. My brother was born in 77. I was born in 79. And between like 74 and 77, 78, they had a great relationship. Just after my birth, like the global economic situation went sideways. Interest rates went through the roof. And my dad, who was in real estate, kind of lost it all. And then supposedly my grandfather, who was very wealthy at the time, offered to bail him out, and then at the last minute changed his mind and walked away from the deal, which kind of sent my dad up shit creek. Again, I don't know all the facts and circumstances, but that's what I've kind of pieced together. And so it's not entirely surprising that a marriage may collapse under such circumstances. And, you know, I don't remember. I was about 2 when they split up, and I really don't have any recollection of them being together or much transpiring over the next couple of years, except for the occasional visit from my dad. And I remember, I guess by that point, he had been demonized in my head as being a bad person. So one of my earliest memories was we were living in Toronto in a condo, and my mom. I was eating a banana, and for some reason, bananas seem to show up fairly often in my traumatic experiences as a kid. I don't know why, but I remember eating a banana, and then my mom told me that my dad was coming for a visit, and I remember starting to cry and spitting out the banana. That was kind of the first kind of vivid memory I have of my dad, or of having such like kind of like a disgust feeling or reaction to like
response. Yeah.
Here's the thing: is that as a kid, you don't know what you don't know. So if your childhood is all fucked up, you have no idea your childhood is all fucked up because it's all that you've ever known. And so I didn't know what I was experiencing was anything other than typical. Not that to say that there's ever a typical childhood, but I suppose there was a lot of dramatics in my childhood that I just accepted as normal that probably aren't. At one point, my dad attempted to kidnap both my brother and I at Expo 86 in Vancouver, which is an interesting story involving George Bush Sr., who was then vice president. But all of this stuff.
How old were you then?
I was 7.
Do you remember that?
I remember going to Expo 86. So we're staying at a hotel. And again, my grandfather was wealthy at the time. So we're staying at the presidential suite at some fancy hotel. I remember being in the car there one day, and there was a procession of cops and limos and all that kind of stuff. And someone asked what's going on, and we found out that George Bush Sr., who was just George Bush then, was in town for Expo 86. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. We came back that day, and we got back to find out that we had been kicked out of our hotel room because George Bush would now be staying at the presidential suite in this particular hotel. So we moved to 2 other rooms.
Makes sense for the president to stay at the presidential suite, I guess.
Yeah, it kind of lines up. And then a couple days later, I don't remember the exact time frame, we went to Expo 86. We came back, and there was just a mad scrum happening in the lobby of the hotel. And what we subsequently found out is that my dad had hired 2 guys to try and kidnap my brother and I from the hotel. But this was back in the day when privacy wasn't really a thing, and you could just call a hotel and find out what room someone was staying in. So these 2 people had called the hotel a few days prior to find out what room we were staying in, got the information that we were staying in the presidential suite. By the time they decided to try and do something, we were no longer in the presidential suite, and George Bush Sr. was actually in the presidential suite. And so they were taken out by RCMP and FBI and the Secret Service for, trying to do something to the vice president's room. It was a little bit of a thing. Yeah, it's really fucked up. But, again, I don't know all the details, and some of what I'm sharing may be an exaggeration or a mistake.
Taken out, what do you mean?
Like they were tackled and arrested. Right.
Okay. All right. I thought, okay. At least it's not what
It wasn't guns blazing by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay. But damn, that sounds extremely tumultuous. And so I imagine a lot but I guess you don't know when you're a kid. As you were growing up, end of high school towards college, did you have perspective on what kind of went on at that point? Or did you, what were the stories you were telling yourself?
Well, that's kind of what started me on the path in some ways to where I am now, and particularly working within the psychedelics field. But, at the time I thought I was perfectly fine. You asked me how I'm doing, I'm fine, and subsequently I've learned that probably not fine in dealing with the consequences and the emotions and all that kind of stuff. I had just learned to kind of keep myself in a very narrow spectrum of what I was allowing myself to feel. I remember at some point being maybe a early teen or something along those lines, that I decided that I was always going to like stay even keel. I wasn't going to let anything kind of phase me. And that was probably a more conscious recognition as a teen. But I imagine that even as a kid, I know I was terribly shy. And so did I have an awareness of how weird or not okay it was to grow up in those environments? No, because you looked at my life and in so many objective ways, my life seemed great. Like we lived in a really nice house on a nice street. I had all the toys I wanted. I never went without. We went on nice vacations. It's like, and so many ways that we measure success in our society, everything was top notch. It wasn't until probably like my late 20s or early 30s that I started to explore the emotional ramifications of exactly what I went through and trying to like let go of them so I could be a lot more of the person I wanted to be. That I became aware of just how maybe messed up that experience was.
So as you were, I guess, like growing up, in terms of like what you were drawn to professionally, like what were you starting to notice about your path as you were like approaching end of high school, going into college? Did you know what you wanted your life to look like, or what you thought you wanted your life to look like?
I don't mean to stereotype Jewish families, but I grew up in a kind of pretty modern Jewish family where there's a lot of emphasis on like academic and financial success, and going out and becoming a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant was something that was, prized upon. And so, I had decided I wanted to become a lawyer, not really appreciating what it meant when I was actually probably about 6 or 7. Some of the lawyers that were involved in my parents' divorce and custody case had come over to our house, and one of them sat down and played Commodore 64 games with me, and he was just like a nice guy. And for much, I guess, of my earlier years, I didn't really have that male kind of fatherly presence. So even for like that brief period of time, which was maybe an hour of playing games with this guy, I remember being like, hey, lawyers are pretty cool. So I told my mom, I think I want to become a lawyer. And in good Jewish tradition, she never let me forget that. And so I had it in my head from a very young age that I wanted to go to law school and become a lawyer. That's kind of where I was. I never stopped to appreciate how much joy and fulfillment and nourishment can come from just learning for the sake of learning. So for me, high school was always a step to university, and university was always a step to law school, and law school was always a step to getting a good, high-paying job. And so I was on a path to trying to get through all of those steps as fast as possible to get to this wonderful career. And then I got to law school, and my first day there, I kind of looked around and I'm like, oh shit. These people aren't like me. I've always been maybe attributable to, my upbringing, who knows, but I've always been somewhat contrarian. I've always been the kind of person who said like, why do we do things that way? Like it doesn't need to be that way, and challenge the conventional kind of process. And so when I got to law school and realized like, oh my God, these are all people on the straight and narrow, and I'm very much not a straight and narrow kind of person, I realized that it was probably not going to be a path I ended on. Notwithstanding, I went through law school. I did well enough. I got a job at one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in Canada. And hated my life truly while I was there.
Yeah.
And then,
being so contrarian, why didn't you use that like contrarianism to question, like, do I actually want to be a lawyer, or should I continue to be a lawyer if I'm hating it?
I mean, it's the golden handcuffs, right? It's what traps everybody, which is like the first job out of law school, they're paying you close to $100,000 a year. You get used to that pretty quickly. And it's like, it's hard to be like, no, I'm going to give this all up and go work for, 60% less, like a low end marketing job. Even though I tried to do that many, many times. But remarkably, everyone told me when I was growing up that, being a lawyer, it's just like a great skill set. You can do anything with with having a law degree. And then I actually tried to apply to jobs having a law degree, and they're like, this is not a law job. This is a marketing job. What are you doing applying for it? I'm like, yes, I can read. I understand it's a marketing job, but I'm fully capable of doing all of this marketing work. I'm probably more qualified in some ways because of my experience, and no one could wrap their head around a lawyer doing a non-law job. And so I was looked over for many jobs I probably could have done very well because of that. So I did try and get off that train. It just took it was just a little bit more of a gradual departure than maybe I had hoped for.
Yeah. So I want to go towards like going to a therapist when you were dating like a girl and your late 20s, and talk about like that conversation. Because like you mentioned before that you were always in this like narrow oscillation between like what were acceptable emotions to feel. And this seemed like a point where maybe that widened.
Sure. So I had started dating a girl somewhere around articling. So in Canada, after you graduate law school, you spend a year basically apprenticing. It's called articling. And I started dating a girl there, and we had been together for a couple of years. And I think deep down, I knew that I didn't really want to be in that relationship, or didn't want it to be the relationship for the rest of my life. But I was terrified about trying to get out of it. And so one of my best friends—
What was scary about trying to get out of it?
In part, hurting someone, in part, the unknown of what does life look like after this. But I think it was mostly like just being truly terrified about hurting someone so deeply was the thing that scared me the most. And so my best friend, Owen, who was aware of like my struggles with this, suggested that I speak to, he's not a therapist by qualification. We'll call him a teacher. Owen was working with him at the time. His name is Erwin Perlman. Just to have a conversation, just to see if Erwin could shed some insight or awareness on what I should do. I said, I resisted because like all my life I was like totally fine, right? That was the narrative. I'm totally fine. And then finally I relented. So I did a session with Erwin, and I went in and I was like, I'm really trying to figure out whether I want to stay in this relationship or end the relationship. And he's like, tell me about your family. And I'm like, what the fuck does this have to do with anything about whether I want to be in a relationship or not? So I proceeded to tell him my family. Found myself like in tears after about 7 minutes, because never in my life had I actually opened up about anything along these lines. And it ultimately got to the conclusion. He's like, okay, so why are you with this particular girl? And I'm like, well, she's smart. She's got a good job. She's pretty. She's funny. And he's like, and I'm like, and what? And he's like, and you don't love her. And I'm like, yeah, I guess. And he's so like, what good is that list of all those things you like about her? He's like, emotions and relationships are fundamentally emotional in nature. Logic doesn't work. You've spent your whole life trying to logic your way through every situation, but now you're in a situation in which logic can't work. It just doesn't work in an emotional paradigm. He's like, you now have to start the work of like breaking down all the walls that you've built up to never feel your emotions, so you can actually start feeling your emotions. And once you feel your emotions, then you can make an informed decision as to whether you want to be in this relationship or not. But if you're just trying to use logic to make that decision, it's like, you can do it, but it's not going to work. And that truly opened my eyes to how narrowly I was viewing the entire world, and what was good and what was healthy and what was right and what wasn't. And it was a massive, massive shift.
Do you think like you didn't love this person because that wasn't the right person, or you weren't ready to like feel that emotion?
That's a good question. No one's ever asked me that before. I think it wasn't the right person. My current wife, Stephanie, I think one of the things that immediately attracted me to her is like, it helped me bust out of who I was, this like narrowly constrained person, and just like let fucking loose. And so for the first years of our relationship, it was about letting loose and like partying and exploring and doing all this kind of stuff. And I needed that firecracker. I needed that catalyst to help me kind of go there. And that just wasn't going to happen in that previous relationship. My girlfriend at the time, she was just more content in, being a homebody and just like having an average life. And I knew that I never wanted to live an average life, that I wanted to like, break shit down and do cool stuff. So,
yeah.
So I don't know, but it's a good question, and it's one I'm going to reflect on because I'm just going off the cuff right now.
You were talking a little bit about applying to like marketing jobs. afterwards. And I want to talk a little bit about how you were putting together an advertisement for a fundraiser. And maybe this was like the first, you might have felt that you didn't fit in with the lawyers, but this is like one of the times where it's like the lawyers, well, I'm not even sure that you fit in with the lawyers. And so could you tell me about during that articling year when you put together an advertisement for a fundraiser?
Yeah. So we were articling, and every year Blake's, the law firm I worked at, does a big fundraise for the United Way. And so to up the engagement, we just decided to enter into a competition with the first year associates, so the class 1 year above us, in a fundraising exercise. One of our fundraising techniques was to do an articling student's shoe shine. So we walked around the firm, I think, had about 8 floors in Commerce Court West, a big tower in downtown Toronto. And we walked around shining people's shoes. And so to create awareness for it, we were going to send an email to the entire firm, and everybody had like these different kind of really long-winded emails about the shoe shine and raising money and all a good cause. And I'm like no one's going to read that. It's like, it's not very catchy. And so I just had a very simple idea saying, send an email around the firm saying simply, first year associates are dull. Don't let your shoes be articling students' shoe shine. And I just sent it to all 1,000 people in the firm. And the response was overwhelming. Like, I probably got 100 emails back from people being like, great email, so funny. And then one partner named Graham in particular wrote back with a very pithy, "Are you too creative to be a lawyer?" ? response. And I stopped and I was like, Yes, very much so. I am much too creative for the work we're doing here. And it was great validation for all of the feelings that were bubbling up inside me, being like, this is not what I'm meant to do. Like, churning paperwork at a corporate law firm is not my destiny. And so it helped inspire me along the path towards eventually leaving the practice of law.
Yeah. And so I want to lead up to that. I know you had a few things in between leaving like your law practice, going into entrepreneurship, or like at least those feelings bubbling up. But I'd love if you could lead me to meeting your co-founders, and eventually the idea for medical cannabis.
Yeah. So actually, a couple months later, I was probably, I don't think I've ever been clinically depressed in my life, with the exception of between like November and February of my articling year. I hated my life. I was so depressed.
What did you hate about it?
I mean, it was extremely long hours. The work was incredibly boring. It was unfulfilling. Under constant stress, with my so-called mentor in my first year while there. Like, I got yelled at, like physically yelled at, arms flailing kind of anger yelled at for what I thought were either not my mistakes or very like honest, insignificant mistakes in a document. And that was just kind of the environment. It was a perpetual like fear of screwing something up and people getting angry at you and not being good enough kind of environment.
What's bizarre to me about yelling? Like, I haven't worked like a real job, really. It's like I kind of went straight into entrepreneurship from college. And so like when I hear people like who say like, oh, like I've had a boss yell at me, I can't fathom why someone would do that. It just seems like the antithesis of like how you create a good work environment, or like how you create good performance. It just doesn't when you're getting yelled at, what are you thinking?
So it's kind of a sad, funny story. So I spoke back to, his name was Craig. And I said, like, Craig, with all due respect, like, I appreciate your concerns here, but I don't work well in an environment where I'm constantly freaked out that I'm going to fuck something up. Like, some people work well under that kind of stress. I don't. And so like the more I'm worried about screwing something up, the more likely I am to screw something up. So if you want to have a productive relationship here, it's like, we got to find a different way to communicate, your concerns or your anger or whatever the case may be. And so I left his office after, the berating finished, and I went to my advisor, Peter, who was in the same group as me. And I told him what happened. And he's like, wait, you talked back to Craig? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, and he didn't fire you? And I'm like, I mean, I suppose I could still get the notice. I have no idea. And he's like, oh, he must really like you actually. And I'm like, what the fuck? And so a couple of months later, we were at a Christmas dinner and I was telling an associate who was a couple of years above me the story. And the story was like, Craig got angry at me, when I was in his office. And then he's like, oh, I can't work with you. I can't work with you directly. You can do the work I need you to do, but do it through like this other associate, but I can't work with you. And so I was telling another associate, it was a couple of years before me, who had gone through the same group. And he's like, wait, you got the I can't work with you speech? I got the I can't work with you speech. And it turned out that Craig had systematically given this yelling kind of speech to every associate that had gone through his group over the years. I guess like this is one of his like trial by fire kind of like training thing. It was awful. But yeah, literally everybody kind of went through that.
That's
anyway,
terrible. That's terrible. I hate that.
So did I.
So you're kind of realizing that this is not the place for you. So lead me up to meeting Joseph and Hannon.
Yeah. So I eventually left Blake's, went in-house at a pharmaceutical firm, went in-house at actually MTV Canada, which was super cool. I got to live out like my teenage childhood fantasy of being like a rock star, at least basking in the reflected glow of rock stars. And then eventually became general counsel at an online dating company, which was a really great experience because I learned a lot about how business actually works as opposed to how lawyers think business works. And so as soon as the business was kind of up and running, I went back and started, and truthfully, it wasn't making enough money to pay me. So I started doing legal work again on the side with tech startups. And it just so happens that one group I got introduced to had started business, sold it to a company. Their golden handcuffs had come off and they were looking to do something new in the tech world. And so we sat down a bunch of times and just like jammed on different ideas. They started one idea, shut it down. And then we went back and met. And like, I was not a cannabis guy, never really smoked. I think I tried it once or twice or something like that. And so they had all a list of all these ideas on a board. It was December of 2013. And we went through them and apparently systematically, I told them how every one of their ideas was terrible. And then as I was leaving and putting on my coat, they're like, well, there's this one other idea. The rules around medical cannabis are changing in Canada and there's an opportunity to do this marketplace thing. And I was like, and why aren't you doing that? And they're like, wow, it's marijuana. I'm like, do we really want to get into the marijuana business? And I was like, guys, like I've been a lawyer, I've been in online dating, I'm a cash for gold buyer. Like cannabis is probably like the cleanest, prettiest thing I'm ever going to work on. So if you're not going to do it, I'm certainly going to do it because you don't get the opportunity where there's no question of product market fit. All you have to do is insert yourself into the industry because we know people like cannabis. And so I cajoled them for a while. We eventually got together, formed two separate companies, Canvas RX and Canadian Cannabis Clinics. Canadian Cannabis Clinics grew to become the largest network of cannabis specialized medical clinics in Canada. We helped 250,000 people access the medical cannabis system. It was remarkable because none of us had any kind of advocacy or love for cannabis. Like a couple of my partners never tried it. So it's the same people as in field trips. So it was myself, Joseph Del Moral, Hanan Flyman, and Dr. Ryan Yermis. We were all involved in Canadian cannabis clinics and none of us had any background in cannabis. We just saw a unique opportunity, which actually I think helped us succeed because we don't look like cannabis people, right? So people were expecting the stereotype and we showed up as, very successful, entrepreneurial, grounded, normal people. And it gave us some perspective. And I think a lot of people appreciated that it didn't look like everything else that you might expect for the industry.
We'll get back to the podcast right after this break. While you're listening to this podcast, you're probably doing something else too, like mastering the art of working out, shaving like no one's watching. We get it. When you're having conversations with your customers, the same is probably true for them. They're slacking their teams, mentally planning date nights, so growing conversation beyond the moment can be challenging. HubSpot helps you go beyond the moment by connecting you and your team so you can access the exact same data and see the full customer picture, what motivates them, what their expectations are, and how you can blow them out of the water. With powerful tools that connect marketing, sales, ops, and service, HubSpot's powerful CRM platform powers you and your teams to transform customer moments into extraordinary customer experiences. Learn how HubSpot can help your business grow better at HubSpot.com. And now back to the podcast.
And that actually was incredibly pivotal for ultimately our work in the psychedelic space, because what I saw personally was just how transformative cannabis medicine could be. Up until that point, I always thought about like it being medicine as being a bit of a euphemism for like, oh, I just need it to get high. But no, it was actually transformative. If you came into one of our clinics, you wouldn't see your typical stoner types. You would see 60-year-old women who have arthritis and don't like the current meds they're on and are looking for something else to deal with their pain. Or you met people with epilepsy or, suffering through the throes of chemo, and they're all genuinely suffering. And almost to a T, every one of them came back and said either cannabis was like a godsend, or they'd come back and say like, yeah, it did nothing for my pain, but you know what? I slept through the night for the first time in 7 years last night. And that alone makes a huge difference in the quality of my life. And so it really shifted my perspective on these once stigmatized medicines. And so after we left the cannabis industry,
Like you were acquired by Aurora Cannabis, right?
That's right. Yeah. So we sold Canadian cannabis clinics to Aurora in 2016. And we spent about 2 years with Aurora helping them grow from what was a small company into a New York Stock Exchange listed company.
What did it feel like to sell?
Felt fucking good, to be quite honest. Like, for any number of reasons. One is like anytime you put a ton of work into something and you see like that outcome happen, there's reward in that. For me, having felt like an imposter most of my life, it felt like a great validation in terms of like actually building something worthwhile. Certainly getting a paycheck, was really nice, and provided a level of, ironically, what I thought was financial security, but it's only in many ways created more financial insecurity in my mind.
What do you mean by that?
And when before, we always made a decent living. My wife and I were both lawyers. It's not like we were ever without, but we were also living paycheck to paycheck to own a house in Toronto and have kids and, live a life. It's like we weren't saving a lot of money by any stretch of the imagination, but we were getting by and we didn't really think about it too much. All of a sudden, you have a windfall and you have a pool of money. And for me, at least, like it became attached to my identity. Having money in the bank account was validation of my success or a reminder of my success. So if it goes down, as Erwin says, like if your self-worth is tied to your net worth, then spending every dollar is really, really expensive because you're not just spending money, you're spending your identity as well. And that's something I totally fell into the trap of, which was like, I started worrying about money, whereas before I never did, because maintaining that baseline of like wealth became, critically important for me. And if it goes below, somehow, for whatever reason, I still can't fully articulate it. When it goes below a certain threshold, it terrifies me. It feels like the entire world is falling. Even though everyone, as an example, like based on the sale, we were able to buy a second property, a recreation property, a farm outside of Toronto, and it's great. And we spend time there. And, you talk to someone logically and they're like, yeah, well, if things get really bad, you can just sell the farm, which is true. But like when your identity is tied up into being successful, to like have to absorb the hit of like a clear demarcation of being not successful anymore, it is really terrifying on a visceral level that I never experienced before. And so for me, it actually has created a lot more stress than it's
especially going through what like you went through as a kid, right? Like I feel like that probably is like something you want to avoid.
Especially, yeah, because like for my dad, he grew up poor, became super wealthy, lost it all, became super wealthy again, lost it all, died not entirely bankrupt, but certainly far from wealthy. My grandfather, who had been extremely wealthy, also died bankrupt. So throughout my life, I've watched boom and bust, boom and bust, boom and bust. And so, yeah, it's particularly vivid for me, the fear of experiencing that again, of going from like feeling like you're comfortable to feeling like everything is existential again.
Do you feel like you have the tools to keep the money you've made, tools that your grandfather and father didn't have?
Certainly like the money that we've managed to build most of like the increase or decrease has been factors outside of our control. We put them into investments that have, succeeded or failed. Just so happens that, I reinvested in the cannabis industry because it was going like this for a long time. And then it's gone like this and like took a large chunk of it out. So a lot of it is not totally outside of my control because I could always shift investments, but I don't trust the markets, to be quite honest, other than like the long-term success of it goes up. The markets are fundamentally irrational. And so you're kind of on a roller coaster ride with an irrational partner when you're invested in the broader stock market, right? As everybody's experiencing right now or, through COVID. Do I have the tools that my father or grandfather didn't have? I mean, I think some of the work I've done has made me okay with the idea of losing it all and not being so existential to my existence. I think I've invested, going back to the conversation about hurting people or not hurting people, I think I've invested in more relationships. Like it's like the thing about, I mentioned before, of always expecting like people to abandon me. I've always kind of expected all of like what I've made to disappear. And so I'm constantly investing in new relationships and maintaining relationships. So in the off chance, maybe not so off chance, but in the chance that like, everything we've built blows up, that, I won't be starting from scratch again, that I have those relationships in place and people I can call on. Whereas at least with my grandfather, like I watched him systematically like ruin all the relationships with people he had around him over time. I can't even surmise why he was like that, but I'm certainly not going to make that mistake. And so yeah, do I have tools? I think I have some tools that they didn't have, but again, I didn't really know my dad, so it's hard to say. And I watched my grandfather implode, but he was also older. And could I attribute some of like his financial demise to probably some degree of physiological, aging and all that kind of stuff? Yeah, maybe some of it for sure. So it's hard to say if I've learned anything from their experience or not, other than I just don't want to go through booms and busts like that. I'd rather have like nice, stable cash flow and lead a nice, moderate, sustainable life.
Yeah. Do you think buying the farm has made you more or less happy? Because it seems like now it's a thing that you can like lose, right? And do you think about hedonic creep in that way?
Yeah, totally. Hedonic creep has definitely factored into it. And like one of the challenges, where it gets more complex is when you have family members, who get used to it. And so, I would say probably the farm has been a bit neutral, which is like, it's certainly added a bunch of stress. By the same token, has provided, the foundation for a lot of joy and a lot of wonderful experiences. And so, I would be grateful if I could cash out a little bit, in some current investments, pay off the mortgage and then not have to think about it. But my money is tied up by virtue of, the activities I'm involved in right now. And so there's definitely an appeal of that. But on balance, I think a lot of the hedonic creep, it's like a lot of that goes to not me. I'm still wearing a J. Crew shirt, that I bought on sale for 40% off. That's, has holes in it. It's like, yes, I've indulged in the occasional, a luxury, and certainly the farm is one, but it is about like, when you have kids, it's about giving them like, I think a lot of best life possible and like being able to escape the city and run around outside. And like, I have seen my 6-year-old going from a very shy, introverted and risk averse kid to a very extroverted, outgoing, super engaging kid. And I can almost, a big factor in that, I think, has, because we had the farm, we put him in a forest school, like an outdoor school, 2 days a week last year, and this year 1 day. And it's like, it has been, I think, generally life-changing for him. And so it's like, is all the stress of like the farm and all the bullshit we have to deal with worthwhile? Yeah, that makes it worthwhile.
Yeah. I guess like hedonic creep, or where you spend something like the farm and that outdoor school, like contributing to like long-term happiness. And so like those kinds of expenses, I think, make sense to value.
Totally. And
Yeah.
listen, I think a lot of the anxiety I have is like my own anxiety, which is like, it kind of felt like when we sold that last business, lightning struck because we sold it. It was a good exit. And then the cannabis industry took off like a bat out of hell. And so what was a good exit became a fantastic exit. And so, a big part of the narrative in my voice, being raised on a deep sense of a lack of self-worth was, you got fucking lucky, man. Appreciate it. And so that in part like lends itself to hedonic creep being like, maybe this may be your only shot, so enjoy it. But at the other time, it comes back the other side, which was like, that was your only shot and good luck replicating that motherfucker. And so that kind of ping ponging back and forth in my head is sometimes hard to manage.
It seems like what you've built is a framework for like achievement. You've built like a framework for what does it look like to enter into businesses and industries that don't have universal acceptance. How can I get that in there early and then like basically be on the cutting edge, new, maybe slightly taboo industries, but have the ability to change the world. Now you have frameworks, and like that's like I think that's exciting and comforting too.
I should come on this podcast more often because you're making me feel much better about myself. No, I appreciate that. And I think there's a foundation of that. And one thing that I've done differently this time than I did from last time is I'm investing in myself more, in addition to our work with Field Trip, like I'm building the podcast and trying to, make sure that when people think about certain things, that even if Field Trip crashes and burns, even though we're super well positioned to take advantage of a massive, massive shift in medicine and culture, I still have a platform to step off of, and I have the network and I have awareness and I can pick up the phone and because I used to always invest in other people, I used to be the martyr, being like, I'm not doing anything worthwhile, but I'll help other people worthwhile. And maybe I'll bask in the reflected glow of their success at some point. And now it's shifted a little bit where I'm like, no, I'm going to invest in myself and make sure people know me and appreciate, that I'm, sometimes I don't often tell myself, but that I'm worthwhile and that I can be valuable and I still have people who I admire, who have been incredibly successful, look at me and say, if I had to start again, Ronan, you would be my number one pick to partner with. And it still dumbfounds me to this day. I'm trying to let it in more and more and be like, wow, that was a genuinely delivered compliment, but it's still so contrary to my programming that it's still hard to receive, but it's shifting.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And it should shift. I mean, you have like you've been positioned for like basically two of the most insane industries in the last like 100 years, basically, especially in wellness. These are going to be massively influential. Feels like we're approaching this like universal consciousness where like more people are being like, oh, like I've seen what you've seen a little bit, or like I can empathize with you a little bit more because I've seen what you've seen in it. It's exciting, and like you're on the forefront of that.
It's totally exciting, and that's why the whole psychedelic conversation in terms of mainstream media is talking about mental health, and it's like mental health is just a small subset of what we're talking about, but like that universal consciousness or whatever it is, that like tapping into something more is the more important of what we're doing right now. I don't know what it is. I don't profess to know what it is, but when, it's kind of like the Matrix, when your eyes have been opened and you see it and you felt it or touched it, even just once, you're like, oh, that's what we all need to be working towards. And that's, what we're trying to do with Field Trip. It's a fine line because we're wading into something that has a lot of skepticism around it, a lot of scrutiny, and everybody, there's enough people who want to see it blow up for whatever reason. And yet I'm still here trying to say like, we're having a woo-woo conversation that you're not prepared to have yet. So I'm like trying to inch the conversation over here a little bit while still keeping it squarely in a paradigm that tries to make it as bulletproof as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what we've seen with cannabis, right? Is like, you have to go the medical route first to then allow people to have it recreationally, because like that's going to be the most palatable for the people that are in like the governmental decision making bodies. Yeah. So I want to, I guess, track back a little bit. And can you tell me about how you read How to Change Your Mind and like when you read that?
Yeah. So what happened, the spark that started the psychedelic conversation is after we left the cannabis industry, we started to do some investing and advising in the cannabis space. And someone happened to reach out to Joseph, one of my business partners, and I wasn't present for it. And she was trying to raise money for a startup, which is now a company called Diamond Therapeutics, which was doing, focused on developing psilocybin microdoses for FDA Health Canada approval. And Joseph left the meeting and I happened to pass him in the hallway. I'm like, who is that? And he told me, and I'm like, wait, psychedelics are a thing? And he's like, I think so. And so we invited her back. We sat down, she told us about Michael Pollan's book, about how MAPS had been granted breakthrough therapy designation for MDMA assisted trials with the FDA. And then importantly, in my mind, she pointed us to the fact that there were 4 or 5 online stores openly selling mushrooms in Canada. And at that moment, I realized that the global zeitgeist had changed. Like whatever was happening, the world had shifted, and psychedelics were going to become a thing, and a very culturally relevant and medical thing. And so we all bought How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. We actually emailed Michael Pollan, just shot him a note on his website. He responded. We had a call with him. We had a call with Rick Doblin from MAPS. This was in 2018 when psychedelics were percolating up, but it's still tiny, but it was so small then that it wasn't uncommon for people to respond to cold emails like this. We spoke to the folks at Beckley, and all of them kept coming back to the same thing, which was, you guys build clinics for cannabis. We're going to need new clinics for psychedelics because setting matter. And so inspired by that kind of field trip was born. And to this day, I have a great relationship with, Michael and Rick and the folks at Beckley. It's really cool.
As you've been building Field Trip, like what are some of those challenges that you're seeing that you've had to overcome? The response to the industry has been fantastic.
I've always been bullish about how quickly psychedelics would go mainstream. And even I've been blown away by just how fast it's happened. The biggest challenge realistically is all of these. I mean, we talk about psychedelics, but what we're really talking about is psychedelic assisted therapies. And anytime you have therapies that require professionally trained people who have multiple degrees spending hours with a person, it becomes expensive. There's no doubt about that. And at least right now with ketamine assisted therapy, there's not a lot of insurance coverage. And so it's a big out of pocket spend. So the people most in need of these therapies, it may be out of reach for them. So that's just the challenge. It's unfortunately, even though it should be a human right, it's still pretty much a luxury good. And that's unfortunate. And so that's the challenge we're working with. But as MDMA assisted therapy comes online, we expect it to start being available in early 2024 based on the timelines provided by MAPS, and because with MDMA assisted therapy, it'll be specifically approved for an indication. Insurance coverage should be much more robust. And so we should see a lot more people getting access to it. The other challenge that exists is for a lot of people, the work with psychedelics is sacred, and how they do it is non-negotiable. And so there's a lot of different voices with a lot of different ways it should be done. And as a relatively modern newcomer to the conversation, and not just specific to us, but a lot of people in the industry, there's a lot of infighting, unfortunately, about, oh, you can't do it that way, or it shouldn't be done that way, or you must do it this way. And that's unfortunate because all of us are working towards the same goal. All of us have the same ambition wherever you are in the psychedelic community. By and large, there are a couple of outliers in that statement. And so instead of saying, I know how it has to be done, and if you do it differently, then I'm going to be critical of you. Let's just all pull together and say, everybody's trying to do the right thing. All of us are going to make mistakes along the way. let's just, work together and learn from each other. And so certainly we've been subject of some ire, as relative newcomers to the space about what do we know about how to do this kind of stuff. And the truth is when we started, we didn't, but that also gives us a unique perspective of like, hey, maybe the way you're doing it can be adapted and evolved and modernized in a good way, not a bad way. And we can make this to more accessible people because we can use technology where technology is appropriately used and reduce the cost in other ways and all that kind of stuff. Going back to like my belief system, which is this is about a lot more than just medicine. I think it's important that we have all the people around the table, having conversations and pulling together.
Yeah. So where is Field Trip today? And what are you most excited for like the near future?
Yeah, so we have 12 locations, 8 in the US, 3 in Canada, and 1 in the Netherlands. The ones in North America providing ketamine-assisted therapy, the one in Netherlands providing psilocybin-assisted therapy. And we have a drug development program developing next-generation psychedelic medicines as well, which is, we believe, the first next-gen psychedelic molecule to be approved for medical use is currently in development in Field Trip, which is super cool as well. But what I'm excited about is that what we've built with Field Trip, I think, is one of the kind of unifying voices across the entire ecosystem, whether you're a medical practitioner, a psychiatrist who's doing the most medically focused Western style of ketamine assisted therapy, or you're an underground explorer, doing psilocybin on your own or whatever it is. Field Trip seems to have become like the home for everybody's hopes, right? Everybody wants to see Field Trip succeed because I think we've brought a very open-minded and progressive voice, and one that kind of no one has a lot to object to, right? We're trying to be all embracing. And so we're trying to shift Field Trip from being a clinic operator to being a platform. That's really our path forward, which is we want to provide everything you need for your journey. And whether that's the most handheld Western medical approach to it, fine. We've got these beautiful clinics with some of the most trained physicians and therapists in the world working in these spaces. And if you just need like a choice of music that is going to be super supportive for whatever experience you're on, it's like it exists within Field Trip and our Trip app. And that excites me because it means that we're just leveling up the whole ecosystem right now. And I'm really, really proud of the brand and how it speaks to so many people. It's like, it really does feel like whatever we've done at Field Trip has been like a ray of light in so many people's lives that who otherwise look out and all they see is bleakness. And so just the fact of our existence seems to give a lot of people hope, which is something I'm really proud of.
What advice do you think you'd give to your younger self or to someone that was in your position, either like doing something that they didn't quite like, or maybe at the beginnings of their entrepreneurial journey? What advice do you think you would give that person?
Really, it boils down to magic. To help people rediscover magic is probably the single most important thing we can be doing at Field Trip. But it also helps answer the question, which is one of my favorite quotes is from an author named Tom Robbins, who said, "You should never hesitate to trade your cow for a handful of magic beans." And I think that's the advice I would give. It's like, you got to bet long shots to win, right? You got to trust like that inner voice that tells you something that is so contrary to what everybody else will tell you. And even though it seems insane, and in many conventional ways it would be insane, trust it and lean into it and bet that long shot and trade that cow. I don't know anybody who's ever regretted taking that kind of long shot. Even if it doesn't turn out, the journey and the lessons along the way always seem to pay dividends. And so that's the advice I'd give.